I'm Travis Bader, and this is the Silvercore Podcast. Silvercore has been providing its members with the skills and knowledge necessary to be confident and proficient in the outdoors for over 20 years, and we make it easier for people to deepen their connection to the natural world. If you enjoy the positive and educational content we provide, please let others know by sharing, commenting, and following so that you can join in on everything that Silvercore stands for. If you'd like to learn more about becoming a member of the Silvercore Club and community, visit our website at silvercore.ca. Backed by popular demand, recently retired 20-year RCP veteran, 17 of those years on tactical teams, 4.5 years with the covert section, 7 years team leader of a Lower Mainland Emergency Response Team, 2 years Divisional Sergeant Major for BC. Last podcast, that'd be Silvercore Podcast episode 55, I started by butchering your name, but I ended with a feeling of reconnecting with a lost friend. Welcome back to the Silvercore Podcast, Seb Lavoie.
Thank you for having me. And by the way, the math doesn't add up here, so there's sums off with this with these numbers.
I pulled this all from the internet. Okay. So
if it was on the internet, it must be true.
I figured I'd just get all of the main points out of the way to begin with. And anybody who wants to listen in greater detail to all of that can go back to episode 55, because that was a very popular podcast, very powerful, a lot of really good information in there. And in this podcast, I was really hoping we'd be able to do a few things. One, a lot has happened in your life since we spoke last, a lot of really exciting things. And number two, you've been on a number of podcasts. You have had the opportunity to grow as an orator, to be able to express yourself with others, but quite often what happens is a podcaster will act as an interviewer and they'll ask questions of their guest. And sometimes there's a two-way flow of communication that goes back and forth. Sometimes it's really one way. And if people are just meeting you for the first time, they tend to focus on the same things over and over again. And if we're to treat podcasting as something that we can use to get better in our own lives, sort of like going to the gym. If you do the same exercises over and over again, you're not really growing. You're not pushing yourself. So maybe we can push past some of the common things that people maybe know about you, some of the myths or misconceptions, and see if we can both grow in this episode.
Sounds like an ambush. I'm in.
Well, okay, so a lot's happened to you since we talked last. First one I'm really excited to talk about is something that's really positive. I'm watching on your Instagram feed, and it looks like you've got something in the works here, something that you're building. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm constantly building something, right? So it's not unusual for me to have a few projects on the go. There's the benefit of having retired from the RCMP so that I can take on the things that are meaningful to me. Right. And that's what my company, Raven Strategic, has been all about. And people are asking, what do you do specifically? I'm like, well, it depends. What do I want to do? And then my company is the umbrella to it, And so I've had, a variety of different pursuits, and I think the one you're probably referring to is a book project that I'm working on.
Yes.
Yeah, so a book project that I'm working on with another amazing individual by the name of Sean Taylor, who's a retired Pathfinder, 2nd Commando, Joint Task Force 2 assaulter, team leader, sniper, just an overall incredible man. He's also, a coach that's coached world champs in mountain biking and downhill racing or extended, I can't remember, like long distance racing or something.
Right.
Anyways, just an amazing orator and an amazing human. And so we've been working on this book project together, which has been absolutely exciting. We cannot wait to push it out.
So he's bringing military, top-tier, special forces background into this book, and you're bringing top-tier law enforcement background into the book. Is that what this is about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the book, the target audience is everybody that's in pursuit of excellence. And some of our experiences in our own pursuit of excellence in how, if I was to put it into words, just imagine if you are putting all your eggs in the same basket and you're pursuing you're singularly minded to one goal, to go somewhere and be at the tip of the spear. Along the way are casualties. Those casualties may be, family, they may be other endeavors you might have you could have benefited from, or whatever the case may be. So
Right.
as people that ended exactly where we wanted to be in terms of career, there was a cost to this. And what we were doing is we're looking back going, I wish I knew this when I was 20, I'm 45 years old now. I wish I could go back in time and speak to my 20-year-old self and see where I could have avoided some of those traps, And so that's exactly and that's precisely what we are bringing: how to pursue excellence, but mitigate the risk associated with that pursuit, if that makes any sense.
Oh, it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
I've always said, what a man thinks he will do. Mm-hmm. If you want to do something, you can make it happen. When you get to the finish line and the goal there, and you look back, did the ends justify the means? And that's a question that people have to ask themselves to approach that with the knowledge ahead of time is invaluable. Knowing that, okay, yeah, there are things that will suffer if I want to push. If I think that money is a worthwhile endeavor for me and I really want to have lots of money, I'll have lots of money. But my family life might suffer. My friends, I might not be seeing them. I might not be learning a musical instrument or doing any of these other things that outside, maybe in the shop woodworking or metalworking. I might put all of that stuff aside so I can single-mindedly pursue that one endeavor. So, okay. Obviously, you've achieved some pretty great things in this very short period of time. Things that a lot of people will look to and say, man, I wish I could do the same. And I think you would probably turn around and tell them you can do the same if you put your head to it. But what would you tell your 20-year-old self if you were looking at getting into, in your situation, you wanted to, when you approached policing, you did so with a single-minded goal. You wanted to be ERT. You wanted to be ERT. What would you tell your 20-year-old self? Is that a worthwhile endeavor?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In terms of having regrets for the accomplishment themselves, no, that's never happened. And we know that there is a cost to sacrifice for the collective. So there is always going to be a cost. It's not like you can completely eliminate the cost that's associated with a life service. But what we are looking at is, was there anywhere along the lines where I started blurring the lines myself and self-impose some hardship that shouldn't have been, or self-impose to myself, or impose on my family, or impose on my friends or my coworkers, or whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. And would there have been a way for me to achieve the same thing without leaving, a trail of bodies along the way, so to speak, right? And so for me, in terms of, say, my first marriage, and I mean, it is what it is in policing, the divorce rates are extremely high. Mm-hmm. But when I look back at some of my, say, teammates that have an incredible family life and are sustaining their operations and are super competent operators, I look back and I'm like, okay, where did I go wrong with my family, with my first wife, where my, and what can I learn from that? It is not to say that at the end of the day, I'd be looking back saying, well, I wish I stayed home. But I think would be surmised to think that I didn't do anything wrong as I was going through the system, through the pipeline towards my goal. And then ultimately what it comes down to is we're always going somewhere, right? But the problem is when you're going somewhere, sometimes you miss the entire journey. And life isn't about the destination. It's about the journey. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I could have appreciated, there is no doubt in my mind that I could have appreciated the things that I've undertook over the years that were in line with my final goal, but would have made me appreciate the daily operation a lot better. You know, and so I kind of feel like I spent so many years working as hard as I possibly could to get somewhere that I missed those years, if that makes any sense.
It makes a hell of a lot of sense, actually. You know, a lot of people don't know this about me, but when I was 19 years old, I wanted to be SAS. I mean, that's what I wanted. I've read the books. I've talked to other people who are SAS, and I figured in order to get there, I need to join the British military and join the British Army, get in, go through the process. And so I was speaking with a recruiting officer. Recruiting officer says, not a problem. You're part of the Commonwealth, Canada. Come on over. We can figure this out. We can get you in there. Just save up your money, get a ticket, come on over, have a bit of money saved aside because the process takes a while and you want to be able to not be living on the street while you're waiting for it to go through. So I did that. 19 years old, flew over to the UK, met up with the recruiting office, and the fellow I was talking to had been transferred. I met with a woman there who said, I have no idea why this gentleman would tell you that you could do it. He said, sure you can, but you can't do anything security related for 5 years. I said, okay, whatever. What's security related? And she says, well, why don't I show you what isn't security related? And it was basically like a janitor. And even some of the janitorial roles in certain areas was considered security related. I said, okay, 5 years, huh? But I've got I think it was a minimum 2-year, whatever the minimum engagement was. I figured, well, I'll give it a shot. Okay, I'd go, am I trying to get in with SAS? And she says, well, if you do this 5 years, you couldn't even start training until 5 years. And so I started weighing it back and forth. As Commonwealth, I needed an extra year. It's my minimum engagement. And by the time the dust settles, I was looking at 8 years to walk out with a possibility of trying for SAS and 12 if I wanted to get some sort of a trade out of it. And I said, man, and especially when you're 19 years old, that's a huge part of your life. And I was just torn. I was absolutely dejected. And I made the decision. I just the ADHD, whatever it is, looking that far ahead, that just seems too big. And I didn't want to sacrifice that many years of my life for something which so many people just for a shot at something which so many people aren't able to achieve. I used the money I had saved up. I traveled around Europe and I came back and I ended up marrying my girlfriend and having a great family. And I've spoken with friends who have gone that route of SF, British Special Forces, and they said, Trav, you made the absolute right decision. Said the recruiting officer was just pouring cold water on you. Honestly, once you're in the Army, once you're in the British military, they'd use you for whatever, right? They might just say that, but they'll use you for anything. And my friends will look back and they'll look at my family and what I've been able to achieve. And they said, honestly, the decision you made was the one that, although I valued my time, I miss out on building that portion. So when you talk about does the ends justify the means, or if there's a way to be able to get to what you actually wanted to do and not have to sacrifice everything, because some things like high-end, I should imagine JTF2, I got a story on that as well, but at JTF2, you don't really have an option but to sacrifice certain things. The Miracle Mile, was that Roger Bannister? Am I remembering this one right? So back in the day, they had people said you can't run a mile in under, I think it was 4 minutes. Mm-hmm. 4 minute mile.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so 4 minute mile is impossible.
The benchmark, yeah.
Okay. All of a sudden, what was impossible became possible, and I believe it was Roger Bannister, and there's a statue out here in Vancouver, another guy, Lenny something, somebody will tell me, I'm sure. But the year after Roger Bannister ran that mile, more people ran it. I think it was like 5 or 6 other people. Year after that, there was like 20 some odd. And now everyone runs a mile in under 4 minutes because they have a framework and they know in their mind that that is a possibility. I'm wondering if in policing and high level work in ERT, if there was quite often a mindset of you just go into it knowing that there's a high divorce rate for police officers and you have to give up everything and take a hard path in order to operate as an at the ERT level. Has that been the mindset in the past? And is that changing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, humans, we put ourselves in boxes. We're really good at that because it offers us a certain amount of control or the appearance of control. And we don't like to be out of control. And really, we're flying in the universe on a ball of water out of control. Like we're essentially, nobody knows what's going on here, you know. But I tend to agree with you, and I think that the purpose of the book and the purpose of Sean and I working together is to bring precisely that. Some of those, you know, answers, some of those, I don't know about answers. Let's call them reflection points where somebody will read that and it may not make a whole bunch of sense at the time, but it will when they are faced with that situation or when they start self-assessing how they are reacting to a certain, you know, part of their professional endeavors, you know, like, okay, I'm seeing a pattern here that's already been pre-identified, and I've been told that this, you know, A, B, C, and D. So that was the point, is to offer the outside the box perspective so that you can still pursue what it is that you are after, and you can get after it like nobody's business and go to the top of the heap or do whatever you want. But know that, you know, those are some of the mitigating strategies that you may employ at various stages.
Can you still have a successful relationship with a significant other and pursue these high-level careers?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Does that mean that the significant other is going to have to just accept the fact that they're no longer going to receive the same level of attention because something else is going to be occupying that? Or is there a way to be able to juggle both of them successfully?
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that in a majority of cases, the relationships that are successful, when people are pursuing, you know, things at the top of the heap, is often the spouses are very supportive, and it does happen that one of them puts their own endeavors on a bit of a back burner, you know, at times to support the other person. But that has to be a mutually agreed upon arrangement. It has to be something that the person is okay with. It has to be something that's reciprocal at one point or another. So, for example, I could be looking at, you know, working the next 5 years to get onto a team or to get into a military team or even an office job, a corporate ladder, you know, climbing the corporate ladder, whatever the case may be. But we need to be in this together, and this is what is anticipated. And this is, but the problem is at times is we want the next and the next and the next thing and the next thing, and we forget that this entire time we were being supported by somebody that may have muted their own, you know, wishes and desires with respect to the professional endeavor. And if there is a way to have that agreed upon and the person is okay with that, that's one thing. The problem is when somebody's being left behind and then everything becomes about the person that's pursuing a certain goal. So there has to be give and take, and there has to be, but you need, when you enter a life of service, you need somebody that's supportive. You know, and that doesn't mean supportive blindly, like all the way through and forgetting about themselves. But then inversely, you also have the responsibility to look back and say, how much support have I been getting, and how do I don't like to say pay it back, so to speak, but it is. I mean, how do I, you know, how do I in turn support the person that's been supporting me for so long in whatever it is that, you know, sort of makes their heart, you know. And so, yeah, I do believe it is possible. I do believe that at some point there has to be, like, the pendulum has to swing the other way. Otherwise, we are looking at possible resentment, and we are looking at a degradation of relationship, those types of things. It takes a very special person to be able to say, okay, I'm going to put myself on the back burner for a bit while this person is pursuing this, you know, higher purpose, so to speak. But
So in the selection process for ERT specifically, there's going to be physical selection, obviously. There'll be cognitive selection. Do they look at your personal relationships to see if you have that support network when you go home? Is that part of the selection process?
No, not really. I mean, it is from a professional standpoint, but no, you're not getting into the person's personal affairs, so to speak, to try to see if they have and ultimately where's the line, right? Like, who's making that determination? So, say you were to go interview somebody, and you come upon a fact that perhaps that person doesn't have the right support at home. Like, what happens then? Like, do you interject and you interfere with their careers, so it just wouldn't work, right? But I think what needs to happen is to let the candidates and the people that are seeking those jobs, so that they're aware that those conversations need to happen, and that it will be very costly, and what the cost could be if they don't, and so yeah, I think just preloading that information into the brains of those that are seeking to do certain things is critical. And that's, again, feeds into the purpose of the book.
So I guess you'd have to be really, really careful about the way you preload that information without creating self-fulfilling biases. So if you're, for example, preloading information that says, a person can run 4.5-minute mile, but a 4-minute mile, I don't know, right? Or if it's sort of, I've heard it referenced in the past. So gunshot wounds, shotgun wounds can be absolutely devastating. Rifle wounds, lots of power. But if you're shot with a handgun, you're more likely to survive than you are to die. If you're shot, the statistics would bear that. Mind you, they were finding people that were dying from wounds that doctors would look at and say, they probably shouldn't have died from this thing, but they did. And some people have postulated that perhaps it's because people have this bang, bang, you're dead mentality. Oh, I'm shot. Next step is, no, I'm dying. And you create this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy or cognitive bias. Do you have to be very careful in how you relay these are possibilities that could happen without ingraining, well, if you're going to be tier 1, you can expect to kiss your relationship goodbye.
Yeah, well, see, yes, and that is not how it's articulated, right? And
right.
so that's precisely how it's not articulated, essentially. So you can be tier 1, you can go to these very places, and you can maintain a relationship. Those are some of the key things and traps to avoid or to see coming, so that you may make the right decisions at the right time based on the totality of your circumstances, not for you to live your life the way I lived mine, And so it's more about giving people the ability to recognize the traps that are going to come along the way and give them, 3 to 4 options. You don't even need to give them options per se. All you need to do is for them to know that options are out there. And so their brain and their mindset is now, and this is how we should be. We should seek to reach excellence in everything, which includes the way we self-assess our reality, right? And so that's also a part of it. So having the ability to minimizing biases and really look at our own self, or at oneself, in a critical, non-judgmental way, but having the ability to say, okay, this is where I'm at and this is where I'm going. And this is a trap that I seem to be falling into here. I know there is possibilities out of this that are not warranting me to break up my relationship or to, stop the hobby that I love doing or whatever the case may be. Therefore, I will focus on finding what this path is going to look like for myself.
When you say self-assess your reality, I thought that was an interesting choice of words. What do you mean by that?
What do I mean by your reality?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
Instead of the reality,
Sure.
self-assess your reality.
Well, everything is contextual, right? And so, and this goes in line with risk assessment, for example. Like a small, tiny little variable might change, completely change the course of action in dealing and resolving a situation, whether it's a tactical dilemma or anything else. And so having the ability to grab the overall concept, which is the concept of introspection, the concept of looking inwards, the concept of not being deflecting the blame, the concept of not staying in a box, as it pertains to my own life right now, in light of, my relationship, my job, my goals, my career aspirations, and all I would say the factors that make it such a complex operation, because Seb might be in front of me telling me that this is one of the options, but for me right now at the moment, it isn't based on this, that, or the other thing. So it's not, don't get me wrong, like it's not a perfect science, but you know what's imperfect is generations upon generations of Canadian service people going through the same things, looking back going, I wish I could go back to 20-year-old me and have those conversations and just walk away and not say anything to the next generation. And the next generation does the exact same thing. So there's no miracle pill here. Like our goal is not to save everybody's marriage, and our goal is not to save everybody's falling in some of the traps that we fell into. And inherently it will happen anyways.
Sure.
Because you'll be warning people and they will be in denial that this isn't them. And now they won't appropriate this information to their own reality, so they'll end up in the same trap anyway. But at the very least, when they're reassessing, having falling in that trap, they'll be like, I was told and I didn't listen. And also it reinforces the point. So our goal is not to change the world. Our goal is to provide different viewpoints of the same, or... I don't want to call it problem, but just different viewpoints. And so that the people that are seeking, excellence in whatever field of endeavor know that there is a way to do it without it impacting versus, you got to be prepared to just put everything aside and just focus 100% and yes, there is some of that, but there is a time for that. And then there is a time for being a dad, and there's a time for being a boyfriend and a husband, and there's a time for the family and the travel and the other things. And there's no way to make it perfect, but you can make it perfectly imperfect.
So, you talk about things like resiliency. I think it was Dave Grossman, he wrote the books on killing and on combat, and he's got a new book coming out, actually, that he's, I don't know if we're allowed to talk about it yet, but it's a couple of Canadian people have teamed up and are writing a joint book, so I'll just put that teaser out there, and maybe we can talk about this at a later time. But he talks about resiliency in the form of people, specifically people who aren't kind of subject to PTSD. At a later time. And Dave Grossman is a highly he espouses his faith as a big backbone for that. And he says that the research has shown that people who have minimal to no effects from PTSD are ones that have a strong sense of faith. And I'm wondering, when you talk about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, of which you're a black belt, in the last podcast you talked about it, when I brought up the point, and I says, are we just learning these things now about how to deal with trauma and PTSD? And you said, when did we forget it? This has always been a part of what we do. Does faith play any aspect into what you do for part of your cognitive resiliencies? And faith doesn't mean having to believe in some person in a cloud. It could be faith in whatever. But does that play a part in your cognitive resiliencies?
Yeah, I believe it does. I mean, ultimately what it comes down to is purpose, right? Okay. So when you're looking at faith, for example, then there's a higher purpose. And so is it directly correlated to the higher purpose, or is it directly correlated to the specifics of whatever faith you are following, right? But I would say that for my part, spirituality has always been a big part of my life, whether, the man-made sort of religious endeavors are not something that I always was not only attracted to, but I was having a hard time with some of the concepts, right? And the reason why I was is because there was certain very evident biases that were injected over time.
Sure.
In some of the religious endeavors. But I would say that in terms of spirituality or really feeling the sense of a higher purpose, I definitely had that. And it wasn't higher purpose as in I'm serving a greater purpose than the person that works here.
Right.
It wasn't that, but it was taking the focus off of myself and going to the collective, right? And that to me gave a strong sense of purpose. Like the collective is what I was truly focused on. What can I bring to the collective? How can I sacrifice to protect the collective? And it gave me such a strong sense of purpose and duty that there's no question that it was easier for me to rationalize some of the emotional injects that I, sustain as a result of my duties. And so humans are, and we've spoken about that before, but humans are 90% emotions, right? And so 10% is conscious thoughts. And the problem with that is that because it's conscious thoughts, we think it's the other way around. And so at the end of the day, it becomes about controlling our emotions, not so much, what our thought processes are. And so for me, I was compassionate, I was invested, I was all those things, but, not over-invested. And not over-invested in things that I can't change. And I would invest my time, energy, and emotions in things that I truly had influence over, things that are directly in my sphere of influence. Things that I have a little bit of influence over, I would invest a little less emotions. Things that are completely out of my control, I gave no time to. Because, you start spreading yourself really, really thin really quickly. And so I wouldn't say it's not certainly not a singular approach to building resiliency.
Right.
It's a multi-prong approach, right?
So, and that was something that I was thinking about before as well. When you say spreading thin, you give a lot. I mean, people who look on your social media feed, there's a lot of positivity that you convey to others. Obviously, we can't be 100% positive 100% of the time. We need those ebbs and flows in order for us to appreciate when it's good, if we never knew what it was like when it was bad. But with that, you're probably going to find that there are people who will cling on to you for that positivity. Do you find that to be draining? Like, there's only so much Seb to give around. How do you draw those boundaries for your own mental health?
Well, one of the things that I did that really helped me was to retire. Because one of the issues was I had my social media presence, which isn't substantial by any stretch, but it was substantial enough, and I was having enough engagement that I would often receive messages and emails and calls and of people wanting to discuss certain things a little bit more and people that needed help. And I always did it. Always. It didn't really matter who you were. I always responded. And oftentimes I'd be responding with, some sort of novel, that I written, because the questions were simple, but the answers were complex. So I would have to launch into those things. And I really enjoyed doing that. But managing my own career and my family life and everything at the same time was very difficult. So when I decided to retire, I made this, which was a passion for me, a part of what I was now doing. And so I started, performance coaching, and I started doing those things. And so now, and it's been a big transition because I never liked to charge people for certain things. And helping people was always something I'd done for free. But now I was running into the scenario where it was becoming overwhelming for me.
Right.
And with my social media as it stands, what I tend to do is and there's so much content out there now with like all the podcasts I've been on and some of the documentaries, those types of things. What I've started doing with people is, because humans will take the path of least resistance.
Yes, they will.
They know I have 30 podcasts out, and they will ask me, what should I do to, become this? Or what should I do if I want to go into policing or whatever? I'm like, listen, I got lots of content out there. Once you are done reviewing and listening to some of those, which is a time investment, and you're not going to get the instant gratification of getting an answer today, but you will get the gratification of knowing you've done the work and you've researched it, and now you have the answers that you are looking for. And if there's anything left outstanding, come back to me and we'll have that conversation. That's kind of what I had to do to draw the line, because I was getting, inundated with the same questions over and over again.
The quick fix.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
And, this is not something that's that only people that are wanting to go somewhere are doing. This is what most people do. So if I was a team leader, when I was a team leader in a team, and the guys had access to me because we're cubicles, were open, and it was like an open floor format. And every time they walked by, they could ask me a question with respect to something that their peers would have known about. And I definitely didn't need to be, tapped on the shoulder for that. So what I used to tell the guys is like, look, first of all, ask your peers. If you don't get the answer, ask your supervisor. And if you still don't have it, come to me. Right? And if there is something that really it needs to be addressed right now, evidently come to me. But if there is a way for you to work out the information so that I can focus on my administrative task and make sure that the team is running the way it should, I'm gonna need some help here, boys. So
right.
Yeah. So it's no different. Humans are lazy by nature, right?
Everyone is.
Yep. And we just want the quick fix. So,
see, that's something that I've struggled with, because I tend to like to help people. And when people ask for help, I will almost always say, yes, not a problem. How can I help? I will drop everything that I'm doing so I can help somebody else. Because in my mind, if somebody is taking that step to reach out and ask for help, well, it must be something pretty substantial, right? Because I don't know about you. Well, I do know about you. You're not the type of person to go out and putting your hand out and asking for people for help. I'm not the type of person to ask people for help. If someone's asking me for help, I naturally kind of think that they must be kind of like me, and they must need something quite quickly. And a good friend of mine says, Travis, the problem with people with good intentions is those with ill intentions will use those good intentions against them. And I don't know if people will do that. Some people will do that intentionally. Most people don't even realize that they're doing it. And being able to draw that line and say, listen to the podcast, listen to the work that I've put out, take a look, read some of the stuff I had. I think that's a brilliant way to be able to ensure that if someone's coming to you for help, that they are putting in the work themselves. If somebody listened to all the podcasts, read your literature, do you feel they would know you?
No, not really.
Right.
I do think that there still are a lot of misconceptions with respect to not only me, but people like me, and it's very interesting. So I'll give you an example. Let's talk about Jocko Willing, for example, right? And I obviously respect Jocko a ton of time for him and everything he's trailblazed and everything he's accomplished, and an amazing leader. But Jocko, who was a Navy SEAL commander, is often seen as this, and to a certain extent, he's responsible for that, but he's often seen as a badass, right? Like, he's a badass that gets up at 4:30 in the morning. eats ammo, and you know,
Yeah.
and so when the younger generations or the people that are aspiring to be in the shoes that Jocko was in, for example, they miss that when he speaks about his guys, he tears up. When he does certain things, and so what we have here is actually an incredibly caring human that cared about his people more than he cared about anything else. And you see that very evidently. So what you're now missing is you're seeing, him working out hard, him being a black belt in jiu-jitsu, him doing this, him doing that. But the reality of what made him such a great leader is the amount of care he put in his people. Right? And so if you were to miss that part, you are now you are crafting yourself into this badass that doesn't have the balance of the other side of this. And there's real issues with this. There's real issues with being a self-disciplined hard ass that doesn't have the compassionate side, that doesn't have, the caring side, that doesn't have that self-awareness, that self-regulation, that doesn't have. And so, and Jocko, of course, isn't going to go out and say, I'm an emotional person, or I'm a person, or I'm a person that, loved, Mark Lee or whoever, passed, obviously as a result of war under his command. But man, if you are paying attention, you are seeing that. But that's kind of with some steps back, right? But if you're singularly focused on a certain goal, and you're looking at David Goggins, and you're looking at the Jocko Willink, and you're wanting to be one of them badasses, you often will miss the other side of that, which is, the rest of the stuff that I just spoke about. So for me, I often, and again, I have, tattoos on my hands. I have this mohawk. I have this. And so a part of that is not self-imposed, but part of that is me creating a certain image with myself, not that image isn't a reflection of who I am, but that image is a part of who I am. It's not who I am.
Right.
Unfortunately, you're only seeing what the eye can see, and you hear a very narrow it's a very narrow view on the inside, on the inner workings of someone, even if you have 30 podcasts. And as you mentioned before, and I couldn't agree more with you, is that people tend to ask the same questions, and we tend to go to same tangents, and we tend to stay in the realm of where I was an SME, and that's generally policing, tactical operation training, those types of things. So it proliferates the stigma.
Right.
Right?
So my high school grad quote, one of them, because I have two different quotes at two different high schools. I think in another podcast that's out there, people will know, I think it was 5 high schools I went to. Got into a little bit of trouble. But one of my high school grad quotes was by E.H. Chapin, and it was, out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars. Now, for you, there's scars both physically and non-physical. And I figured in one area that's easy for us to talk about, the easy things that we can go through, areas where you're an SME, and we can talk about that. And maybe we can talk about the other one as well. And it's something that I think a lot of people listening would get value out of. But let's start with the easy one. You came in here. I was surprised you were walking in. I offered to give you a ride in here because I didn't know what your mobility was like. You've suffered a pretty substantial injury. Did you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. So on August 25th of 2021, so this year, I was having a minor surgery done on the left calf compartment. And I was in Toronto, Canada. And that night, I started experiencing what we now know to be compression syndrome. Compartment syndrome.
Yeah.
Yes, I stand corrected. I should know.
You should know. You've got it.
This goes to show. And so, I felt a bit of a victim of my ability to withstand pain because I associated the pain that I was feeling to the surgery that I had earlier that day. But really, the pain I was experiencing was much higher than what I should have experienced. I just didn't know, right? So I remained in compression for over 26. And this is a total oversimplification of this story because there is a few calls to the doctors and a few trips to the emerge and doing all this stuff. But ultimately, the end result was I was in compression for 26 hours. And essentially, for those that don't know, compartment syndrome is, and this is again an oversimplification, but it's basically the muscle is swelling to the point where it outgrows the capacity of the pocket that it's in, which is the fascia. Once it happens, it starts restricting blood flow by constricting the blood vessels and the nerves and everything. And if there is too much time spent in compression, a muscle may die from essentially oxygen starvation, right? So muscle and nerves can die, at which point they become useless to you and they need to be removed before they send your body into a tailspin of toxic shock. So after 26 hours in compression, between August 26th to October 1st, I had 9 surgeries they call them debridement, where they remove necrotic tissues from my left leg. Essentially, the totality of my left calf. Not that I had any substantial calf before that.
I love that you can joke about it.
Totally. But they took whatever I had that my friends could make fun of and removed the totality of it, which causes its own set of issues. But anyways, when I was in Toronto, I spent 28 days bedridden, taking opiates and pain medication that was evidently required at the time so that I could heal. The issue that came after was I was sent home with the same opiates and my pain level was now a lot lower.
Right.
And so managing the lack of tapering, as I like to call it, because I essentially went cold turkey, was, a problem. But so now where it stands now is the wound is closed since October 1st. And I have been able to walk and do certain things, like I can do jiu-jitsu and, not to the extent that I could before, and I generally pay for it later, but I can still engage in a reasonable amount. But right now where we're at is January is the reassessing date, as my tibial nerve was believed to be dead. And if the tibial nerve returns, which I believe it has returned, there's kind of 2 possibilities. It's either we are going the reconstructive surgery route, which would mean that foreseeably I'll be in surgeries for the next, 2 years. I'd probably have another 9, if not more, to try to rebuild some functionality in that leg, which is also an unknown because we don't know what the end result is going to be, or the tibial nerve or the nerves are not sufficiently back and a determination is made that amputating that leg below the knee is the best option. I have my thoughts on that, and the conversation is obviously a cooperative approach to problem solving this with the doctors. It's not just a one-sided affair where they say, well, we want to keep the leg, and I say we want to, let's take it off, or vice versa. But it's a cooperative approach. Like, what are we looking at? What is the prospect? What is... And really conduct a risk assessment to see which one of those 2 options is better for me when the time comes. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And I would say that the biggest downside right now is the ancillary issues that I seem to have related to the condition. So that's the neurological, there's something called the neuropathic itch, which, once the central nervous system is affected deeply, it may trigger a hive sort of, feeling as if I have to scratch myself all the time because I'm itchy and it gives me shivers. I'm constantly cold, and at night I will have night sweats, and I've had night sweats for, 3.5 months or so. every night. And we are talking about, multiple changes of clothes and
From the neuropathy.
yeah. So we don't know exactly where it's coming from. Like the blood levels are all good. Everything's kind of good to go. But somehow I still have all these ancillary issues. So, so that's been a challenge, but it is what it is.
So obviously the physical side, there's lots of pain that's associated with that. There is the interesting side note about the medication and the opiates that they put you on. And you said you just decided that's it, cold turkey, I'm off of it. Well, what was that like?
Yeah, it was stupid.
Yeah?
That's what it was like. So, and then when I say it was, I'm not deflecting this to anybody else. Like, I was stupid to do it the way I did it. And whether or not help was available for me, I really try to reach out. And at the time, I will say this, in the United States and in Canada, there was really nobody responsible for the transition from a certain level of taking pain medication to address pain, and then through the pain is now 6 levels lower, and how do we taper off? And there is a science behind that tapering off. It's not just the logical linear approach, like, oh, well, when I felt, say, on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the most pain you could feel, if you said, well, I'm a 4, and now I was a 4, and I took this much medication, now I'm a 9, I'm taking this much medication, therefore, if I go back to 4, I should go back to exactly what I was taking, because it doesn't work like that.
No, you got a hammer on top of it.
It actually doesn't. Exactly. So, and so what we have found is there is a problem beyond the pandemic with respect to opiates and overdosing in the States and here in Canada, which a very, very serious problem, which also, by virtue of me doing all the research to try to fix what I knew was fixable, I also stumbled upon the fact that, hey, man, like a lot of people that are on East Hastings or on the streets today, a lot of them have been legally prescribed opiates to begin with,
right,
as a result of a surgery or an injury or whatever. So it's a terrifying prospect. And and so for me, it took time, and it took a lot of pushing the medical professionals along the way to help me get off the opiates. And I do not have an addictive personality at all. And I was...
Are you sure?
Yes.
Somebody who, even exercise, even pursuit of excellence, you wouldn't say that would follow into an addictive personality?
No, I believe... Here's what the difference is.
Okay.
I need to work out every day. Like, I need to work out every day. If I don't, I don't feel right, or I don't feel right about myself, or it messes up my day, and if I don't, and if I skip it for whatever reason, I'm disappointed in myself, or I have to make it up, or whatever. I was never like that. For me, it was about, I need to work out. It's a self-sacrifice. I don't like it. I don't care for it. If I don't do it, I couldn't care less. If you gave me the same level of fitness, I'd be sitting on the couch somewhere, reading, doing other things with my time. I don't know if that makes any sense. So it was a means to an end. It wasn't, this must happen. This must happen, but it must happen in order to get this done.
Interesting.
So it was more of a professional responsibility that I had to train like that. People always say that to me. It's like, well, you love training. No, I don't. Give me the same results and let me just hang out. I will use those many hours spent in the gym to do something else.
Right.
And even if there was a certain degree of addiction in this, the responsibility of making sure that the people that are taking these medications, in my opinion, is on the medical world, right? Like you have a responsibility as medical professionals to not only assist the people with managing their pain, but also the follow through. Like, how do we ensure they don't end up on the road, on the street? How do we ensure that they don't end up overdosing? How do we ensure that they don't end up affecting their way of life, their families, And so there is a responsibility, and somehow somehow for the longest time in the Canadian system, it was nobody's responsibility. So there was zero accountability. And so I was informed that very recently, Vancouver General has had a transitional pain clinic created.
Smart.
But we are talking about how many years have we been handing out opiates like candies?
Totally.
I mean, it's been, over 20 years. So, and the amount of people that are suffering deeply from opiate addiction is unfathomable.
So there's I believe he's a doctor, at least a professor. I believe he actually resides in North Vancouver. And at some point, if it's something the listeners are interested in, I might just reach out to him. But he pioneered a study called Rat Park. And I don't know if you've heard of this one. And it's come under fire. Some people have different ideas on it, but the end results of it has led to more harm reduction in people in the downtown east side. But the essence of it was they were doing studies on the addictiveness of different types of narcotics, and they stuck a rat into a cage with a water bottle, and they lace it with cocaine or methamphetamines or with opiates, and they would find within a few days and they'd give them two different water bottles, one with water and one with the drug lace one, and they'd find that this rat, more often than not, would go to the drug lace one, and next thing you know, a few days later, the rat's dead because it just couldn't get enough. And this individual with some others postulated, well, hold on a second. We give diamorphine to our grandmas when they break their hip and they come out of the hospital and they're not ending up downtown east side. Why is it that some people find themselves on this downward spiral while other people don't? Is it that the drug is so addictive, or is it the environment in which they were raised in and that they're currently in, and they introduce this drug into it? And so he said, let's make Rat Park, and they'll give them a whole bunch of other rats to play with and other rats to mate with and wheels to turn on and all different types of toys and stuff. And he came back and said, yeah, there's some rats that would like to party and they'd like the drugs, but only a few. And they weren't doing it to a point of killing themselves. But by and large, given their druthers, these rats would go for the water over top of the opiates. So I think when you're talking about having a proper pain clinic, holy crow, is that ever important? I'm wondering if people have to be genetically predisposed or cognitively predisposed in order to be suffering from addiction from these opiates, or if it's just the opiates or the drugs, whatever it might be, in and of themselves, it's enough to cause that hook. I don't know.
I don't know, but then what we have to look at is the things that we do know. If we're not providing anything, we're now essentially making a stance that if you're addicted, you were meant to be addicted, and if you're not addicted, you're just not.
Right.
Whereas we're providing the information, what people do with the information. Because ultimately, the doctor isn't going to come to your house and make sure you've taken one instead of two, or that you've followed the tapering procedures to the letter, and you are, So there's always a way. But what do we do? Do we throw our hands in the air and say, well, people are just predisposed to, being addicted to opiates, and I don't think we can take that at all. Like it's. And we do that quite a bit. We do. I as humans, I feel like we're doing that quite a bit. I feel like this ties right into another thing that we see a lot of is let's not explain to people why we do certain things. And I'm referring to in the policing context, for example. It can be taken out of policing. But let's have people have a really strong opinion on something, and we will not go and ahead of or in front of the camera and attempt at explaining or articulating why it is that we made a certain decision, because they will not understand.
And that's entirely
It
untrue.
is entirely erroneous.
Yes.
Like people are way smarter than we give them credit for. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time to kind of process the information, and perhaps it has to be delivered properly, and the person has to be genuinely credible and have all this information. to offer and answers to some of the rebuttals. But we do that all the time. Mm-hmm. You know, we paint people in boxes. You're either addicted or you're not. It's not that simple.
You know, and I'm looking, I mean, Surrey's getting a new police force out here. I think that's, well, what are your thoughts on that? Having spent so much time with the RCMP.
Ambush number 2.
We don't have to get into that one.
Hit the front vehicle and the tail vehicle, and I'm stuck in between, trying to get off the X. Yeah. No, I mean, I think I've made my thoughts known on that. I would say that a lot of the things, those are not mutually exclusive. So there is what's being done to create the police service, which is, who they hired and what they're trying to do with their leadership and what they're trying to do with their model is a positive. Like, there's nothing wrong with what they are doing. Mm-hmm. There's also absolutely nothing wrong with the way the RCMP has done business for the last however how many years that we were in Surrey. Now, the issue is the things that are now being offered to these guys in their new capacity are the things that the RCMP was asking for so that they may do the job properly.
Right.
Right? So for me, it's sad that we, are now telling the current members of the RCMP, like, evidently you weren't good enough and you didn't do the job hard enough and you weren't there for us, or whatever the case may be, when clearly there was a lot of areas that were lacking, that were communicated over and over again, that weren't being resolved. And now we're setting up the new police force for success by giving them all the tools that the RCMP has been asking for so long.
Right. How does that affect morale?
And it's a really tough one, right? It's a really tough one. I have friends on both sides of that fence, which I don't think there is a fence, but I'm just, they're like I said, they're not mutually exclusive. Like, both of them, to a certain extent, are doing the things right, but there is the political environment and everything was changed, so the context was changed, and now you're gonna be assessing the results or the outcome of having implemented a new police force and say, see, I told you that this was the right way to go. Mm-hmm. Well, what you have done is given them what the RCMP was asking for. So,
and the reason not to just completely go off on a tangent, I'm just wondering, the reason I brought that in was not tangential. It was because I'm wondering if it's got to do with the way that the RCMP was communicating. And had they communicated things differently, there's this whole defund the police mentality going on in the States, and the RCMP is a large target, right? In Canada, they're a large organization, and they've been around for a long time, and consequently, when they're in their position, they're also kind of easy for people to throw rocks at if they're at the top of the pole too. They're going to make mistakes, they're going to do things that are well, but had there been a different approach in communication, had they treated the citizenry as if they were intelligent or more intelligent in some areas, or maybe less informed in other areas, and used their role to publicly inform, do you think we'd even be in this position?
Yeah, it's really hard to tell, because it's really hard to quantify things that weren't, right?
Of course.
How do you know how it would have impacted? But I can tell you this: current RCMP commanding officer of the division, now Dwayne McDonald, was an ACOM at the time in Surrey, responsible for Surrey, and he was out with some solid arguments and some solid articulation as to why they were doing certain things, and even went to the extent of explaining to the citizen, we've been asking for those things all along, just so you understand, and providing context, doing all this stuff. And he did a fantastic job, which was very unusual for the RCMP, for such a high-ranking person to go out and do it. And evidently, he's got the charisma, and he's got everything. He's an excellent leader. Former Earth guy, by the way. And,
doesn't hurt.
Yeah. But yeah, so I do believe that there was an attempt made in communicating those things. And, whether or not it would have made a difference if it was at a higher level, I have no idea.
I'm wondering how much hands are tied here, because at a political level, it was interesting. I was talking with an individual, Nicholas Johnson, and he says his idea on public safety. And he says, public safety should start from the individual level. The individual should be able to take care of themselves and should be able to take care of their family. And from there, each individual is able to protect themselves, and consequently, you achieve public safety. But he says we've gone backwards, in his opinion, where public safety is now something that's been abrogated onto some other body, in this case, policing or the federal government, to turn around and say, we will provide you your public safety. Do not take matters into your own hands. Do not train yourself in certain ways to be safe, because we will come after you. I'm wondering if the RCMP situation was more or less sort of being hamstringed by the current political climate of not allowing individuals to defend themselves or to be responsible for their own public safety.
I feel like you're specifically talking about firearms here.
Not specifically. This individual was specifically talking about firearms, but it can come into, let's say, martial arts. You're learning self-defense for yourself. You're learning a system for morality in some of the martial arts, right? You're gaining a teamwork and connection and all of these different things. But if you want to go and use that yourself, you're going to have to be very well schooled in the legal parameters, right, that surround that, so you're not using excessive force or you're not instigating or doing things that are offside. But as well, there seems to be a general attitude that's portrayed over and over again. Don't worry, just call up the police. We'll take care of you. Call up. Don't take care of this yourself. The government will come in and take care of you. And people seem all too willing to sit back and say, what's the government going to do to fix this, right? I mean, you look at on Abbotsford when the flooding happened and their local government said the pump stations were going down. The local government says, don't go there. We're going to send police out to keep guys away. This is a dangerous situation. And it's primarily farmers and normal citizens that came out and said, no, we're going to take matters into our own hands and we're going to work. And there was so many people that showed up that the fire department said, well, you're here anyways, let's put you to work. And their efforts abated a disaster. Maybe before I go too far off base there, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on people taking personal responsibility for their own safety? And is that at odds with where the current political climate would currently stand? Like, people are afraid of being sued. The government wants to try and do something and say something, but not really do anything, because if they really put their neck out there, they might get sued. I guess that's a slight tie-in to what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. People are responsible for their own safety in terms of situational awareness, in terms of having predicated contingencies and implemented some safety mechanisms in their own lives. And I have never in my 20 years in the RCMP heard the RCMP management or anybody say people shouldn't be doing that. And so what the problem and what makes things a little blurry is that if we tell if from a political standpoint, if we tell the population, okay, you ought to do these things, then there is an expectation that there ought to be money for these things, that there ought to be support for these things. That so there's implication with doing that. So from a political standpoint, but it's like, do you need to be told everything? Like, no, I don't. I don't need to be told everything. I don't need to be babysit through life by the government, so to speak, right? And so, and then with that, what comes next is the deflection. Because a lot of people will not want to take responsibility for their own safety. That's somebody else's job. So that way, when it doesn't go according to plan, there's somebody else to blame,
right?
Not me, right? And so how do you reconcile that, right? And first of all, what we need to stop doing is wearing rose-colored glasses, right? And we need to have the conversations, and that starts. Where does it start? Does it start in school? Does it start later? Is this is there a communication strategy that we can employ to remind people? And everything that we do and we choose to do has potential ramifications, whether good or bad. And so, for example, if somebody was taking martial arts, and that the purpose of them taking the martial arts is that they can defend themselves should the need to arise, well, then they need to know what are the limitations of the ability to defend yourself in this country, for example, and what are some of the traps to fall into. Because it's really easy. Something happens, I feel threatened, and I react a certain way. The person ends up being struck with a closed fist. The person goes to the ground. I stop there, disengage, call the police, tell them to, whatever the case may be, or I just add an extra kick in the head while they're down.
Whoops.
No, exactly, right? Yeah. So where is that line? Now, same thing happens again, but this time the person that's now on the ground was reaching for something in their waistband, and I added an extra kick. Was that reasonable?
Absolutely.
Yeah, based on the totality of the circumstances, I think a reasonable person would say, yeah, this, and there's a lot of leeway there as well because there's no professional training in those various, there's no expectation. So, for example, if a police officer or off-duty police officer responds a certain way, there is an expectation, a professional expectations of how this should be handled, whereas a civilian has a little bit more leeway, right? And so they don't need to know the law nearly as good. They need to know it. They need to know where the rights start and where they end, and how to stay within those boundaries. But I guess the point I'm making is, so now if you've gone to your martial arts studio and you've started training yourself and you've done all this, but you've never looked at the legal side of things, whose fault is that? Don't look around. Don't look around. There's nobody else to blame.
That's it.
So we have the internet. We have open source things and information everywhere, and reliable source of information to boot, not just any information. And yes, there is information out there but you generally can see it really quickly. You just have to read the comments. You just have to, and you'll get a sense as to whether or not the source of the information is reliable, right? And so if we are to take responsibility for our own well-being, if we are to take responsibility for our own safety, then we have to take responsibility for where our rights, stopping, basically.
So where I was going with this, because I wanted to touch on the Surrey thing, and I thought that was a perfect kind of segue to at least talk about that generally. And I wanted to talk about the personal responsibility part, because you're talking about your leg, and you've got some options that you have to weigh right now. Growing up, I had a neighbor down the block, and he'd throw pickleball tournaments every year, and there was prizes that were given away that were just crazy. I mean, a car was won one year, a TV. I mean, it was just nuts. Anyways, this guy's license plate was a highly derogatory term for anybody from South Africa, but nobody over here knew it. But in previous years, this fellow was in a motorcycle accident, and I forget what bridge he is going over, but he had his leg ripped off. And doctor said, your leg is useless. It won't be able to do anything with it. You're done. You're amputated. And he said, F that. Sew the thing back on. I don't care if the thing rots off me or putting it back on. They did. And end result is he's able to play pickleball and have these tournaments, right? And he walked around with a limp, but he took personal responsibility against the wishes of what the doctors were, based on his gut feeling more than any medical profession. If it comes to a point where the doctors look at you and say, it's our professional opinion that we're going to have to be looking at amputation, how are you going to deal with that? Would you take a similar approach to this individual, or what does that thought process look like?
So far, it's been the other way around. They are wanting me to keep it, And I'm telling them and I'm trying to convey to them that the level of functionality that they're offering isn't going to work for me.
Okay.
So I'm not keeping this thing with a 40% functionality rate. Like, this is not conducive to my lifestyle at all. It's not conducive to me going out doing the sprints. It's not conducive for me to be jumping. It's not conducive to me, hiking and doing whatever I really enjoy doing in life. Some of the things that are not necessary but are the way I lived my life, and I enjoy it. So what was very apparent to me is that the way they measured functionality rate and what's acceptable and what's not was a different person than me, right? And so, your leg is going to look, it's going to look nice, it'll be, and eventually down the line you may even get implants or whatever to try to balance your two legs, and because I don't have a calf muscle on the left side. So for me, it was kind of the other way around. Now, there's a ton of anecdotal stuff around, like, you can go to Panama and get some stem cell research, and you can do this and that, and if you have $150,000 and all these other things. Okay. So at the end of the day, I'm going to have to make a call. And that call is going to be based on educated guess and evidence-based, right? Because we don't know for sure what's going to happen. But what I do know is this. If I send myself into another 2 years of reconstructive surgery where opiates are going to be required, right? Because we've spoken about the downside of opiates, but let's call a spade a spade. Don't take them and go through too much pain, and you're not healing because your body is in fight or flight, and it just simply will not heal. It just wants to survive. Right, so there is applications for these medications. There is and we can't discount that. But I'm not really interested in spending the next 2 to 3 years in reconstructive surgeries. I'm not.
Right.
And that's if I was 20, it's a completely different story. But right now, at my age, my career mostly behind me in terms of like the career I really was seeking, is kind of behind me, and the need for physicality to the point where I needed it is behind me as well. And so for me now, it's more about when can I go to Iceland, and you know what I mean?
I'd love to go to Iceland.
I know, same here, right?
Yeah.
And so how long do I want to be on those painkillers? How long do I want to be going through? And the surgeries, I mean, we're talking about this. You have 9 surgeries. I mean, this is nothing compared to somebody that was overseas that walked over, an IED or whatever. But it's still substantial to have, say, 9 surgeries. And if you have another 9, that's 18 total. And they just don't happen miraculously. In between, there's recovery time, and then they go back. And then it's an incredible amount of investment. It's an incredible amount of pain. It's an incredible amount of pain management. It's an incredible amount of, it's this hardship, right? And so the alternative is, say you go down the amputation route and you are now looking at, say, a 60, 70, maybe 75% functionality rate. Over the course of the next, say, 6 months, you're going to be, wearing that prosthetic, doing things that there is no way in hell you would have done.
Right.
And so now, people will talk about phantom pains and all these other things. Well, I get that right now.
Right.
I get that right now. I have like the incredible, the pain that I have in there. So the answer is no. I'm not going to keep that limb at all cost. And quite the other way around. I'm also not in a rush to get it amputated, and I'm not making any rash decisions with respect to it, but it's going to be an evidence-based risk assessment that's conducted to the best of my abilities with the opinion of medical professionals taking into account. And then we're going to go from there. When I look back at the outcome, favorable or not, I want to go back to the decision-making process, take the emotions out of it, and say, based on the totality of the circumstances and based on what I knew at the time, this was the best call to make. It backfired or it worked out, but you can never be blamed for making the right call.
Right.
It is what it is. It was a reasonable call at the time. It didn't work out or it worked out, but ultimately,
Based on the information you had,
That's
that
all
was
you-
the call.
That's all you can do. That's all you can do, and that's exactly how I look at it. There's no overwhelming emotional attachment. There's no, there just isn't. It's just
Interesting.
it's kind of it's a process, right?
Interesting. Yeah, the lot of different ideas that we can chat about, but maybe I'll just leave those for the moment. You have talked about your desire and willingness to stand up for injustice where you see it being a very easy decision for you when you see it in others. Less so when you see it in yourself. Why do you think that would be? And this is going back to your last podcast, your very last podcast that you did with, going to get in trouble here.
Dave Moreau, are you talking about that?
I believe it was that one,
the
yes.
Hard to Kill podcast?
Hard to Kill, that's exactly it. And by the way, Hard to Kill was the name of the Steven Seagal movie we were trying to remember at the time.
Yeah, I remember that now.
No, Mark for Death.
Mark for Death.
Mark for Death.
Yeah, because we called it Hard to Kill,
That's
but that
right.
was a different one. That was with What's Her Face?
Yes.
His former wife.
That's right.
What was her name now?
With the worst love scene ever.
Yeah. Well, it's Steven Seagal. What do you expect?
Yeah, Mark for Death, because they put the tongue on his door.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Wicked movie.
Yeah.
If you're into Steven Seagal. and
Which we
stuff.
obviously are.
Can you rephrase or reframe that question? Because I'm not getting the.
Okay, so you made the statement that you always found it easy to stand up for injustice when
Sure.
you see it happening to other people.
Yeah.
But you let, and I think I got it in my notes here, but and I don't want to misquote you, but you generally said that you find it difficult to stand up for injustice when it's happening to you.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it at an early age, so maybe that was back then and
Sure.
not so much now.
Sure. Yeah, that was contextual, and it was in my youth.
In your youth.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, and this was specifically attributed to my ability to physically defend myself or others.
Okay.
So so basically, I would stand up for bullying when other people were being bullied, and be prepared to sustain physical harm in interfering with the bullying process. But when it happened to me, I just didn't have it in me to fight it. So so it was a strong sense of responsibility that somehow took over me almost to an autopilot style when somebody else was being victimized, but it didn't kick in when I was. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I wonder why. I wonder what a psychologist would turn around and say about that.
I think a psychologist has already taken the day off after sitting with you for a while. It's like, I spent an hour with you, $9,000, and never call me again.
That's right. Oh, man.
Yeah, no, this was specific to a weird propensity that I had of stepping up for helping everybody else and just not have the ability to do it for myself, and which eventually changed substantially.
Did you, because you've talked openly about your mother and what a great person she was and all the roles that she played in your life. You have talked openly about the lack of a father figure, or a lack of a father, I should say. Maybe not necessarily a lack of a father figure. I think mothers, when children are developing, are incredibly, incredibly important up to a certain age. After a certain age, the father takes priority. When a child needs the nurturing and the loving and the affection that is generally attributed to a mother, when they get to their teenage years, a father will teach a boy how to be a man, and it'll teach their girls what kind of a man is acceptable and how a man should treat a woman. Did you find somebody in that role to be able to assist you in your development? And do you think that the lack of having the, let's say the father in your life, put you in a position where you want to stand up for others and you want to basically be the man for others?
Does Van Damme count?
He was the reason I learned how to do the splits at an early age.
He was the reason why we did a lot of things.
That's right.
Well, it is, while it is important to have a father figure, there's a lot of people out there with their two parents and that still don't have the perfect picture, right?
Sure.
And Mom, knowing all of this, doubled down on making certain things happen that she knew were going to be shortcomings in my life, really.
Right.
And whether or not that's affected me on a subconscious level, I don't know. But what I do know is the primary reason why I hated injustice is because I was always on the wrong end of it, from a very, very young age. And this could have been attributed to a variety of things, but one of those was Quebec in the 70s, and we're not talking about Montreal here, we're talking about the North Shore, the suburbs where it was mostly not visible minorities, and I was clearly different, but I was also different. So I was different and different, in kind of in more ways than one. And I paid a hefty price for that difference, like a hefty price from a very young age, and it was sustained. And it wasn't just the people, it wasn't just my peers, the other kids. It was the teachers. It was, there was an inherently racist bias. And trust me, I am not one to pull out the race card.
No,
I never have.
Right.
But I can tell you this: that was blatant. It was blatant. And it was, the circumstances were such that, I'll give you an example. I'll give you actually two examples, right? The inherent bias associated with who I was as an individual, based on what I look like. One of them, a little girl. So some little punks were, teasing and doing what kids do consistently, which is fine.
Sure.
And one of them kicked a ball at me in an attempt to hit me with it, right? And I raised my knee, and the ball bounced off my knee into his face. And so he now goes to the teacher, complains about me. The teacher never comes to me. What happens, though, is during the class, she's going to make a point, and I end up on all four with the kids beating me. So she puts me down, and she essentially allows every single one of those kids to come in and throw a kick in, right? So there is no attempt at trying to ascertain the facts of what happened, because despite the fact that that kid was coming after me, I still felt bad for hurting him.
Sure.
Sure. And so there was really no attempt at coming to me and say, hey, what happened here? Like, obviously he's bleeding from his nose. The ball was returned to his face. It sounds like you may have kicked it. What happened? Well, actually, he was trying to hit me, and I just raised my knee in a knee shield kind of way, and the ball bounced off my knee into his face. It was accidental. Okay, so there was no attempt at doing that. Instead, I got a beating, right? And so fast forward a year or two later, they ran the first ever school Olympics. And in there was shot put, high jumps, sprints, pull-ups, like whatever.
Right.
And I don't know how to... So anyway, what happens is after 2 days of competing, I am now have won 9 out of 10 gold medals, and there's one discipline left.
Yeah.
Okay. So thunderstorm comes in, the whole bit. We've already seen a room full of trophies and medals and like accolades, out the yin yang for whoever are going to win those disciplines. And the teachers have been all over. Like the entire week was about those Olympics, those mini Olympiads, right? Or as they call them.
Sure.
Back in Quebec. But now we're on day 2 or 3. I've cleaned up, in every single sports or events.
Yeah.
It starts raining. There's some thundering. Everything. They shut everything down, and they basically say, "Okay, we're gonna resume later." All this stuff. We never resumed. And they never handed out the prizes. Like they never handed out the prizes, and they never, there was never. So it sounds like a very innocuous thing,
but it's not.
It's not, because here's what happened to me. I was a champion.
Right.
I was a champion. Yeah. I was born to be one, and I was going to be one. Mm-hmm. And the rest of my life was spent being a runner-up because I never truly believed that I could be the champ. And it sounds like an over-dramatization of, but it isn't. It's taken such a toll on me that I always found myself short of winning, and it affected me in other areas. It affected me in math, and it affected me in other things because I stopped believing I could, after being cheated. And it took me years.
Totally.
It took me years to realize that. Like, this isn't like, at the time I already knew that, you're messing up my life,
Totally.
And it wasn't that. And it wasn't that it did mess up my life, but it certainly has it had
an impact.
It did.
I mean, there's a few different things that I'd love to chat about here, because that makes me angry when I hear that. And I guess one thing, just so I don't forget about, essentially dealing with that anger, because that's something that you can carry with you for a long time. But I can empathize in some ways too, because I was 6'4" by the time I was in grade 7, with size, I think it was 13 shoes at that time, and towering above everyone. Always a tall kid. And I was always raised, be careful. You don't know your size. You got to don't just go half speed, go half. And the people who were smaller were always encouraged, go hard, right? You gotta make up for the fact that this guy is so much, and it does stick in your psyche, always feeling like, I got to be gentle, and never being able to truly live up to your potential. So I can empathize with some of those things, but the part that would make me angry is just like the systemic racism for no any other reason, how they treat an individual. How do you reconcile some of those things? Because what happens in your youth are things that are slowly but surely fired into your brain, and by around 30 years old or so, they make up your personality. Neurons that fire together, wire together, I think is how they put it. And when everything starts solidifying up, despite there is neuroplasticity research and we can start rewiring our brains in certain ways, you're probably, if I'm to guess here, spending a fair bit of your time rewiring sort of what happened in your youth into an area into a way that you want it to fire properly now. So how do you deal with that anger, and do you find yourself having to rewire yourself?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that I think Jordan Peterson would be more qualified to answer. But I will say this. The reason why I was so successful in both my military and my police career, especially in the context of tactical operation, for example, is that there is a game that's being played there, and that game is you're not good enough to join us. Mm-hmm. You're not, right? And so the worst thing you can do to me is to say, we expect you to be good. But if you're telling me you're nothing and you'll never make it, it's like, watch this.
You just watch,
right? And so from a performance, from a psychological performance standpoint, for me, being in environments where I'm consistently being told I'm not good enough is where I excel. Whereas if there's a certain expectation that I'm absolutely going to be the greatest, then I start, that's when self-doubt would start to creep in and that kind of stuff. So what I know happened over the years is I just channel that anger. Like anger firing in all directions is one of the worst emotion you can possibly, and it's the bodyguard of sadness, right?
Exactly.
They refer to it as the bodyguard of sadness. There's a reason for that. And it's also one that's really easy to exteriorize. It's one of the emotions that's the easiest to exteriorize. It's also one of the most damaging one. But also it has tremendous ability, if channeled properly, to use it for fuel. And that's essentially what I did. I had a lot of anger, I had a lot of resentment, and I essentially knew that being successful in whatever I took on was the best way to get payback. Being that person that can and will and would get it done. And so in my teenage years, at about, I would say 17, 18-ish is when it truly happened. And I started being very focused on where I was going and how I was going to go about doing that, and using the fuel to essentially, drive myself forward. So it was a rechanneling, and I don't know if it just happened organically or if somehow there was a trigger, I don't know.
Interesting. So, when people look back, sometimes they'll look at things that have happened and that'll evoke emotions of anger or regret, or maybe they'll just look at something and say, hey, that's a good experience I learned from, look where I've grown to. They've been able to frame it in a possible way. But often I found that looking to the past will, if you're going to feel any regret or remorse, that's all going to be past-based. Fear is, in my opinion anyway, completely future-based. It's got nothing to do with your present reality, and it's got everything to do...
Often doesn't have anything to do with reality.
Totally, right? Like, people are afraid of the dark.
Yeah.
Okay, why? Put a light switch on, and it's bright out. I remember as a kid, actually, I was afraid of the dark, and I think a lot of kids are. And my father was ERT. He was in charge of him for, I think it was about 7 years, actually, for Vancouver. And so brought out a duffel bag, and I put on the balaclava and black makeup and get all darkened up and learning about the principles of camouflage and shine, sheen, movement, silhouette, shadow, like all the general things. And he says, okay, now you are the night. Now you are the darkness, and you are what other things in the dark are afraid of, right? And so just that simple reframe of the idea. But getting back to fear being sort of a forward-looking thing, have you found yourselves in situations where you're feeling fear? And everyone does, I think, at some point or another. And how would you deal with that?
Well, it depends. And the answer is it depends, right? Because contextually, it makes a big difference for me. So, for example, professionally induced fear, where there's a reasonable fear of harm, say, on a tactical operation, but then there's also a disconnect because it's a professional achievement. It's a professional, so then it makes it easier to address in that context. And then you have the fear of, say, I have 2 teenagers right now, and one of them will be driving next year. That's terrifying.
It is.
It's a terrifying prospect because I feel like she is 11 in maturity, level.
Right.
And this is no secret. Like, she can listen to this. She
Sure.
knows.
That's right. Well, that's your perception.
No, of course.
She clearly isn't, but that's just the perception that we have because they're always our babies to us.
And so I would say those are two different things, right? And the way I dealt with fear, and I don't recall like being overly fearful in the professional realm, mainly because we maintain tactical advantage. We've maintained, there's a variety of things that we can do to address the issues that could potentially make that fear become a reality.
And the team helps with that
that's
too,
right.
knowing you have that support.
That's right. And then when it was on an individual basis, I had been where I had been. I'd been a bouncer during the biker war in the Rock Machine, the Hells Angels. There's a ton. So my sort of threshold for fear was quite high, and very rarely do we encounter that. So it wasn't a big issue. On the personal side, I mean, it's no different right now with my daughters and my daughter getting her license next year. And it is a part of life, and it's just about letting go. That's it. There is nothing else. There is nothing else I'm going to do. I'm going to have the conversations with her. I'm going to have to, I know there are advanced driver courses out there. I want her to have that. I want her to have defensive driving once she's had some time on the road. So to provide her with the tools to mitigate the risk, not to eliminate the risk, because there's always a risk. If I provide the tools to mitigate the risk and something happens. You know what I mean? But it's a different story from my perspective, if I haven't done everything I could to mitigate the risk and then something happens. Now there's the constant going back. What could have been done? What could have been done better to make her safer? What could have been, So it's almost like fear being a very emotionally based sort of reaction. Most of the time can be controlled with rational thoughts, which is, provided that they are grounded in reality. So if I know there is a process to make her that much better at driving, I will reduce my fear. It's not good. It will not eliminate my fear, but it will reduce it to a manageable level, which is what we should strive to be, right? And then there's an element of luck in everything as well, and you have to know that. But the harder you work, the luckier you seem to get.
It's
right?
funny how that works, isn't
weird.
it?
Yeah. So for that specifically, and I'm using this as an example, that's going to be my way to risk mitigate and manage my fear. Because otherwise, we know what's going to happen. I'm going to be overbearing. I'm going to,
Sure.
And you can actually send somebody in the tailspin that you're trying to avoid by creating all this extra pressure. So now I'm say transferring my fear to her by saying now she's not a confident driver. Now she is terrified of everything that moves, and now she's focusing on the wrong things, or not, and maybe she gets in an accident as a result of having been so overwhelmed by the fearful emotions that I transmitted over. And again, there's people that are much smarter than me that could definitely pick that apart. But for me, that's the way that I mitigate fear in most scenarios.
You realize you just provided her with a perfect out for her first accident. That's your fault.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, she also knows about deflection though, so she'll be taking blame.
Yeah, smart kid.
Yeah.
You are transitioning. You're transitioning from a position within law enforcement at a high level, and maybe you're looking back and said, I should have got my surgery while I was still on the job. But there's a transition process now back into civilian life. I know some people seem to be able to do that rather gracefully. Some people have a very difficult time. In my observations, it's usually not something that they find difficult right off the get-go. The first difficult part is, like, what am I going to do with all my time? Then it's, how do I organize my time in a productive way? Because it feels like I have just so many things to do all the time now, when I previously, that was well organized. And then I see the transition going towards people wearing all their police shirts and police stuff so they can advertise to people that they were at one point law enforcement, because they're maybe missing that level of what that brought to them. And one of my friends, he's been retired for some time now, and he says one of the most difficult things that he's finding as he gets older is he doesn't feel dangerous anymore. And it sounds weird. It sounds like, oh, who cares, to a lot of people, but to somebody who spent his lifetime in his profession feeling dangerous and feeling capable control of all these situations, That's a difficult thing to square. You are now transitioning from law enforcement. You're transitioning into civilian life, and you're fast-tracking some of these things by some of the physical issues that you're working with right now and working through. How are you finding that?
Yeah. So, one of the issues that seem to plague the policing and the military world is letting the job define you. And I have never done that. However, however much I love the job, I never let it define me. And I did that by engaging in outside activities. I did that by having friends that were not cops. I did that by finding a sense of purpose in various other things, like the gym, for example. When I was owning 2 CrossFit gyms, and I was actually a coach there, and I was teaching my athletes. And then the other side, when my martial arts studio and with jiu-jitsu and everything. So I had all this infrastructure around me, and so policing and being on ERT or being a team leader or being a sergeant major or whatever the case may be was simply a part of who I was, but it wasn't who I was. If it is who you are when you are no longer, we're having some serious issues. One of the things that I was on a course in with a certain special operation unit, and one of the key problems that kept on resurfacing was when members go overseas and they're these special operator type, like, super studs and superhumans really, would get, say, blown up or something would happen, then they would come back and all they had was this defining, mission set and this defining job that they had, and now they're finding themselves, sans purpose and it's not the case, but that was the perception and how difficult those situations were. We've seen it on the RCMP side where people retire after 33, 34, 35 years and die within one.
Right.
Because now all of a sudden it's all of this is gone. So there is quite a few traps, which is again part of the book, and that to avoid going down the path of letting your job define you. Now with that is a sense of reality. Are you dangerous though? Are you? You know what I mean? Because arguably it depends. Right?
It depends on how you define dangerous.
What does that even mean? Right? Because if I stand in a lineup at the bank as a BJJ black belt and I look around and there's 8 people, there's a good chance, I'm the person in there. There is a good chance that could potentially inflict harm on others. Guess what? Every street corner is somebody that can hand you your behind, right? And then you want to talk about gunfighting? Sure. Let's talk about this. Would you bet? Would you gamble your next gunfight as thinking that you are the best shooter you've ever met?
Never.
You know what I mean? And so there is an overinflation. There is a propensity to overinflate one's capabilities. So let's take the same scenario. I'm standing in the lineup in the bank, and now there's a pro MMA fighters with like 45 fights and all this good stuff. Like all of a sudden, my so-called toughness just taking a back seat. Right?
Sure.
Because now I have somebody in there that's actually paid to fight. That's their job, to be that much better. And it's not to say that there is no way I can win. But the point I'm making is part of letting a job define you is the overinflation of the importance of you within the context of that operation.
Right.
It's not true.
Totally.
It's not. Like when Seb Lavoie left the outfit, people can say, oh, it was a great loss and all this stuff. Those are people with human interpersonal connections. But in the big scheme of things,
the machine keeps turning.
It just does. Right? And so I can't stand there and overinflate my importance or the importance that the organization, inversely, overinflate the importance that the organization had for me. Right? That's tough. It's hard to do.
It is. So you left after 20 years. You felt like you've done your thing. You could have got a better pension, if you wanted to keep plugging away and going through for another 10 years, but you left for a reason. What was that reason?
Well, I left for a variety of reasons, but the primary reason was that I joined the RCMP to be on the emergency response team. That was my sole purpose in life in terms of professional purpose in life. That's what I wanted the most. I had been there, and I was given an opportunity to return there after my stint as a sergeant major, basically as a operational non-commissioned officer. So I would have went back there as the team leader for the team leaders. Okay, and so I'd taken the job. I'd said yes to it and everything. And every morning I started waking up or having a hard time sleeping. Insomnia seems to, and I've been an insomniac most of my career, but it made things worse. And then I had to come to the realization, looking at myself in the mirror, that perhaps you don't want to go back. Is that a possibility? And I had to ask myself the tough question. And then I started thinking, it's been 2 years. I haven't been on call. I haven't been dragged out of bed. My stress level is incredibly manageable. I don't have to deal with, tactical operation, the resolving of same, and, HR related issues with, and it's not with our personal proper, but just the administration of such a high-speed team. And so what happened was I was honest with myself, and I said to myself, I don't think you want to go back. And I don't think you should go back if you don't want to go back, because I know that you are going to have to give your life to the team again in order to make that happen,
Interesting.
Yeah, so I knew there was going to be a ton of sacrifice of the things that I was now connected with after being off the on-call, off getting pulled out of all the events with the family and, the dance recitals and the birthdays and this and that and the other, which I missed a ton of along the way. So I came to the realization that I didn't want to go back. So now what? If I don't want to go back, and that's the only reason why I was here in the first place, now what? I either found a new passion within the organization or I go elsewhere. And what ended up contributing to me going that way was that I started wanting to pursue meaningful things with meaningful people. And that's what that's kind of my, and I don't like to call them buzzwords, but that's my buzzwords right now. Meaningful things with meaningful people is what I'm after. And so I really wanted to take my skill set, my acquired skill set, professional skill set, and transpose it to the civilian world while taking on the things that I truly wanted to take on and being, basically using passion and judgment to get the things that I really wanted to get engaged with done, rather than doing 90% things that I had to do and 10% things that I wanted to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's you're definitely making those strides really quickly. I was climbing in Squamish with a friend of mine, and he brought another friend of his, and a buddy of mine who's been on the podcast before, and his buddy is ex-JTF too. And he said, that's all I figured I wanted to do, and that's what I worked hard for, got onto JTF too, and I looked around, and these people weren't like me. And I didn't feel like I fit in. And I withdrew myself. After all of that work that I put on, I was on there for a while. He says, just some of the things weren't, he was in his head a lot from what I gather. He was thinking a lot. They said, go in this room, shoot all these targets, right? And of course, some of the targets are ones that are made to look innocent. And he comes, he's like, I get it. I get the process of going in, follow orders, shoot and go through. But I mean, there's a target of a mother with a child, or and I would articulate afterwards why I didn't shoot, but that wasn't part of this particular drill that we were doing. So he withdrew himself because he didn't figure that it didn't turn out to be exactly what he was hoping it would be. Did you find when you got yourself on with ERT Did it live up to the expectations of what you're hoping it would be, or were there differences in there that you weren't even expecting?
Without launching into, what was said, I will say this. There is nobody walking around of any organization after either leaving it or being asked to leave it that paints a picture of the issue being themselves, And so I'm not suggesting that it's
right.
I'm not suggesting that it's the case here.
Oh, it's 100% the case here.
But it's generally when people are leaving or when people are asked to leave a certain unit or decide to leave a certain unit, there is an inherent something was off with the unit and I just didn't jive with it, or somebody did this, or how I was wrong by this person or that person. So I would love for, in a case like this, what I like to do is I would love to have the version of the instructors that were watching and what the drill was, and what were the circumstances, because you can build a drill, as you can build a drill and make it that it's a completely different, like the decisions that you are going to make inside that room are based upon the context and the totality of the circumstances.
Right.
So in 99.999% of the time, shooting that mother with the kid is completely unacceptable.
Right.
It leaves the 0.09% where information is given that changes that.
That it wasn't a kid, it was an IED
or whatever,
right?
Exactly. Or that she was rigged,
right?
Even with a kid, right? And so, I would love to, to kind of dive into it and get the two sides, because there's generally one side, the other, and then the truth somewhere in the middle.
Well, he openly says it is what it is, but it wasn't him, and he was the one that didn't fit in that piece of the equation. Because
sure, but what I don't like about that statement is that it implies that everybody in that room was cool with shooting a kid and a mom. And
that's a good point.
And that I don't believe in.
I don't believe
so.
For 1
so
second.
there's something missing.
Yeah.
Right. And whatever that might be, it's because people that are not familiar with the soft units and the way they operate is very different from the traditional military and the idea that people have on World War II, and you're going to do this, you're going to do that. We're talking about intellectual humans with incredible physical capacity that are very capable of problem solving, and not only very capable, but they are expected to problem solve things without the help of the leaders,
in a very quick way.
Oh, absolutely. And so for somebody to tell me that everybody in that room was totally cool with murdering a mom and a child, it just, there's something that's completely against the soft.
Which of course they aren't, and they weren't, and they weren't.
So that's all. That's the reason why I'm saying that. I would love to hear.
I like that perspective because I find that so often in everyday life. If someone's going to break up with somebody else, it's because the other person was A, B, C, and
all
D.
the time.
And I find it as an employer dealing with my coworkers and staff, when you can see at some point when somebody comes to a point and it's like, they're ready for their next challenge in their life, but they don't know how to be able to take that step without trying to demonize something. It's whatever. It's the customers. It's the job. It's whatever it is, because somehow that clicks in their head as an acceptable way, rather than just saying, you know what, I had a good time when I was here. I put 110% in, good, bad, learned, grew, time for my next stage. And that's something that I try very hard to relay to everybody that I work with. Hey, when it's time and it's your time, we will help you 110% so you can make that next step in a successful way. And in fact, I might even have connections in the industry or the other areas that you might be looking to go to. And that mentality of approaching leaving an individual, an organization, or something else, I think is incredibly healthy. But I don't think it's shared by most people. Most people, like you're saying, they'll take the approach of, well, it's just me, but it's because of this.
Yeah, I mean, we see it in the in promotions processes, and we see it in who was wronged when and how, and who was passed for promotion first. I mean, nobody goes, you know what, my leadership skills really needed to work.
Right.
Nobody wants to follow me. You know what I mean? Like, I look around, and because it's hard, right? It's hard to expose those shortcomings, but it is necessary, and having the ability to do so is so liberating, because you can address the issues if the issues are identified, but also it's kind of really refreshing to have somebody take responsibility for their actions. When you're speaking to someone and they come out and say this just wasn't for me. It's just this wasn't for me, and I wasn't the right fit, and I pulled myself out. And I love that. I've over the years I've had so many members come to me and say, and it's funny because when I walked by in an office or something, it's almost like people were drawn to tell me that they were going to get in shape so that they can get the ERT. So it'd be like, I'm going to get in shape and I'm going to try out. And dude, like, you've told me this 28 times in the last 5 years. You're not trying out.
Just do it.
You're not working out.
Yeah.
You're not going to do it. So why are you wasting your time telling me, what you are going to do? Because there is a sense that somehow they feel compelled to tell you what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. Whereas I met this one guy and he's like, I would love your job. I'm way too lazy. And I just laughed so hard, and good for him.
Yeah.
Loved it.
Yeah.
I was like,
well, people like to varnish over their own imperfections. But like you say, liberating, empowering completely.
Totally.
Taking that responsibility from a third party. I left this relationship because they were A, B, and C. Well, you know what? They're probably A, B, and C to begin with. And maybe you overlooked it because of DEF, right? Whatever it might be. And then now you're coming around to it. You're leaving because you've made a personal choice. It's time for you to leave. Once you're able to take that level of personal responsibility, all of a sudden these issues you're no longer affected by external issues. Everything falls under your locus of control. You affect every little aspect of what you do. Interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, it bleeds into everything. And, to go back, and this is going to sound like I'm kind of going backwards, but when we spoke about the way I felt me being different affected me as a youth, for example, it sent me into this other side of things where when people ask me, like, how did you feel as a visible minority, as a, half black person in the organization, and how, what kind of challenges were you against and everything? None. That's how.
Awesome.
Zero, right?
Awesome.
Why? Because it wasn't about what every other thing could do for me, or for me to see my own failures as a reason, as the reason being my color, say, in the organization, or my skin tone, or whatever the case may be. But it reversed the onus on me. Like, what have I done? And what have I done to prevent these things? And I just I was a hard target. You are going to pick somebody else if you have a choice. And so and it prevented me from falling in the trap of like, this was racism related, or this was like pulling the proverbial race card, so to speak, right?
The pity party.
Yeah. And the thing is I have people that have the same skin complexion as me that have had issues their entire career everywhere they went. It's like, okay, I'm not an expert, but it is possible and it is reasonable that you have run into 1, 2, or 3 people that potentially I never ran into that, treated you differently on account of X, Y, and Z. Everywhere you went, everybody is racist. You're the issue.
Right.
There is zero question about it. Like that, is just it isn't a reality. So it's kind of like you're driving in traffic in the morning and you listen to radio, and on the radio it says something along the lines of there's a crazy driver driving the wrong way on street, whatever. You look up and you see a whole bunch of them and you're like, there's more than one, you know? If there's more than one, it's probably you.
Yes, yes.
So that's a critical piece. Stop relegating your failure or your failure to achieve certain things based on predicated factors such as race, gender, those types of things, because a lot of the times it actually had nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not taken away from the fact that at times it does have to do with it.
Right.
But it's a different mindset, you know?
I 100% follow.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the next steps here for SEB Lavoie, and what needs to happen for you in order to be able to get there? I see you rocking some nice Thrudark gear. Are you going to be on one of their commercials? We were watching one earlier. That was fantastic.
Yeah,
eh?
boys. What are you guys doing? You need me in your commercial.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I discovered this company out of the UK, and as I understand it, two SBS guys or Special Board Services guys are owners of that company. And of course, suffice to say that their commercial and are going to ruin me about that. But they have, you know, when I encourage a company now, when I encourage a business, it has to be something I truly believe in. It has to be something that suits me personally. You know, I may love a nice, you know, BMW, whatever.
Sure.
But I'm a super snake driver. I love Shelby's. Why? Because they're me, you know. And it's the same with this company. That's truly, I think what you are seeing is the tier 1 excellence being exemplified at every step of the way. So we are talking about website, we're talking about product, we're talking about packaging, we're talking about delivery, we're talking like everything is so dialed in, and it's, you know, it has that special operation, you know, touch of everything everything they touch turns into gold, because they have so much of that, and so much of that comes from their ability to look inwards and be truly critical of their own performance, you know, which is very rare.
Yes.
And having the ability to do that has allowed them to grow substantially really, really quickly. And so I will continue to encourage companies like this that fall in line exactly with the way my mind works, you know. And the product is amazing.
Phenomenal. It's phenomenal. So you got the book coming out, and it's going to be both in audio format and in written format.
Yeah. So what we've done with this is, you know, we have recorded a ton of content, and the idea was that following the book, there is going to be, I believe, there is going to be a lot of interest in finding out how all came about, how it unfolded, some of the funnies, you know, behind the conversations. I mean, because it wasn't all, you know, rainbow, sunshine, and applesauce. Excuse me. In fact, just to tie this in, like to tell a funny story that wasn't so funny at the time, is when we started recording. You know, I had been on so many podcasts. I was like, wow, this is going to be easy. We sit in front of each other. Say if we're going to address leadership, I'm going to go out on a rant, and you are going next, and we kind of feed off each other that way. Sounds easy, but it just didn't work. It didn't work that way. We sat in front of the mic. Our first, like I would say, 4 hours of recording was utterly useless. Like we tried to put things together, it just wasn't flowing. It wasn't, and so the half of that first day was an abject failure. And we looked at each other, and I got that sense inside that, you know, that premature panic, you know, like, oh shit, this might not be as easy as I think it's going to be, and this might not go anywhere, and then your mind starts running a train on you, which of course I stopped immediately because I knew what my mind was doing. This was uncomfortable, and we needed to get through it, and we needed to find a way out of it, and that was also uncomfortable, and so I didn't want to do it. And so what I did is, and what we did really as a team, is we sat down, we stopped the recording, and we said, okay, how are we going to problem solve this? And so we had a conversation and decided to speak about something we truly, truly wanted to speak about.
Okay.
Like, it didn't matter if it didn't fit, if it wasn't the intro, if it wasn't chronological or any of that.
Yeah.
We just wanted a win, right? And we said, let's go get some rest. Come back this afternoon. We knock it out of the park, and we're on our way, right? And so we did. We went. I had a nap. Sean had a nap. We came back together. We decided to speak about, boom, this subject, which at all was not chronological with respect to where we were in the process. But we knocked it out of the park, which built up our confidence. And then from there, we couldn't fail.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But having the ability to recognize, like, this is a point here where premature panic can set in and I can let it consume me, and I could have. And when I say, if you are somebody, like I'd flew somebody, like a photographer from Montreal to come over, she's fantastic. Tanya Lam is her name, amazing photographer. And she came over.
I saw her work. It's amazing.
It is.
Yeah.
And so she came over to document absolutely everything to make sure that we had a ton of material to follow up once the floodgates are open and people are wanting the information, instead of, oh man, I wish we did.
That's smart.
Yeah, we did it. And so we have it. So we have audio, video, we have pictures, we have all kinds of stuff that we can launch into for the next little while. But for me, as the person that organized this, as the person that, quote unquote, led the project, the feeling of premature panic really hit me hard, to the point where I was on the verge of, like, self-sabotaging there, And I caught myself. And I was like, okay, you're going to shake yourself out of that stupor, and you are going to go for a nap, and you're going to come back, and you're going to reset the clocks. And that's what's going to happen. And so we came back, reset the clock, and everything went well and smooth after that.
That is awesome. It's amazing how many times people will not even take that first step because they can't get their head wrapped around the rest of the process. How do I start this business? How do I write a book? How do I'm not a good author. I'm not good at ABC. Well, what are you good at? And how can you use those things around you to help buttress that? I know another friend of mine, I went to school with him, and he wrote a book with somebody else. It was called Sociable back in the day, right when social media was kind of coming up, and he was showing people how to use social media in order to propel their businesses and themselves, and what it can be used for and what it can't be used for. I'm like, what the hell? You're writing a book? He's like, we just sat, we talked to a tape recorder, we sent it over to India, they transcribed it, and now I am on the lecture circuit because I'm able to talk about what I'm passionate about and what I know about, and those people who actually are able to affect their dreams and embark on these endeavors in the way that yourself and others do, the older I get and the more I look at other businesses and people who are building things, the more I see that it is basically just the process of putting one foot in front of the other. Number one. Number two, the ability to pivot when they need to. 3, the accountability level is being able to take that level of accountability. It's not the fact that I can't write. I mean, I can talk on a microphone. Someone else can transcribe it. The pivot thing, I mean, that's why Instagram's around. I mean, Instagram started out as, what was it called? Bourbon or something like this. And it was supposed to be, you could write down information or take pictures of restaurants and review food. And they quickly pivoted from that into what they are now, into a multi-million-dollar industry. And then, the ability to, even though pivoting can be very important, the ability to persevere. And that is the one area, like how you persevered. You could have easily given up and said, yeah, forget it. This sucks. We can't continue with this because we're going to have to try something else. The ability to persevere and continue plugging away. What do they say? The plugging away will win you the day. Don't be a piker at Old Pard. It's Robert Frost. The ability to continue down that path is what separates the successes from the failures. So many people would give up at that first job. And then I saw you and Sean over, where were you? You're drinking Mai Tais or something.
We're drinking Mai Tais in Haiti because that's a real tourist destination right now. It's really hot for tourism.
I know.
Yeah, Sean and I ended up going to Haiti working on a security project there, and nothing super sexy for those that are, have the word mercenaries in mind.
Yeah.
It wasn't what we were doing. But yeah, there's a ton of good work to be done in some of the more challenge areas. And that's something I'm truly passionate about. I mean, that's, I'd love to go to Mali and help problem solve some of the command and control issues they have in whatever venue or whatever the case may be. Those are truly meaningful endeavors, Being on the ground in Haiti for 4 days was a reminder, and it's not ethnocentric. I'm not trying to be ethnocentric in my statement here, but we do have it quite cushy, and I think that a lot of people forget that. And once you go in a place where things are very difficult, such as in Haiti right now at the moment, on a variety of different fronts, like not just human factors. There's also other factors, earthquakes and this and that, and it's a very, very, it's a very difficult place to live in right now at the moment, and they're doing it, and everybody's up at 6:00 in the morning doing things. The kids are going to school at like 6:15 or some. It's just crazy to see. But Sean and I having the opportunity to go overseas and help problem solve the issues, I am all over it. I am all over it. If there's anything that needs help somewhere that falls within the sort of the realm of our expertise, I'm in.
What I find really impressive, because I'm talking about the plugging away, and it might have been Robert Frost. It'll come to me. But anyways, probably Robert Service. The fact that you put your head towards what it is you want to do, and then you're filling in the blanks. This is where I'd like to be. Here's where I am. And with that goal in mind, you're filling in all of those blanks in order to get there. Mm-hmm. You're taking something that you don't have a roadmap right now to any of these different things, but you know what you'd like to see out of your lifestyle, and you're making it happen. And that is truly inspirational. I'm really, really looking forward to your book when it comes out. Maybe I can get an advance copy. I don't know.
You might.
Yes.
You might be in luck.
Hey!
Yeah, for sure.
Is there anything else we should be talking about before we wrap up?
No, I mean, thank you very much for having me back. Really insightful conversation, both of them, really. I was listening to the other one this morning, and I really enjoyed it. Once the book comes out, it'd be nice to get Sean and I, to some airtime so that we can have, because evidently right now I'm trying to give some without giving it all, because I don't want to get the carpet taken from under us.
Right.
But once the book is out and the information is readily available, we could have a great chat with another, outstanding human.
100% that'll happen. Seb, thanks very much for coming on the Silvercore Podcast.
Thanks for having me again, brother.